Okay, we finished off yesterday talking about the day of Pentecost was the beginning of the last days. And that's even brought out, confirmed that in Hebrews chapter 3, chapter 1, verse 3. It says, God has spoken to us by his Son in these last days. We're in the last days. God is speaking to us by his Son. Jesus came to the earth. We have his words recorded to us in the scriptures. God has spoken to us in the last days by his Son. We are in the last days. We've been in the last days for 2,000 years. Are we in the last of the last days? Well, let's look at some things that the scripture tells us about that, living in the last of the last days. Now, in Joel, I don't know if we're going to have time. We may visit that, but I don't want to take time right now. But Joel lists four signs of the last days. He talks about blood moons, and we've had those in recent times on the Jewish holidays, holy days, coincidentally, an establishment of major significant historical events. Joel talked about Israel's return to the homeland, which we saw on May 14th, 1948, something that had never been done before, a supernatural sign about the last days. And many believe, and I believe that also, that the um, the beginning of sorrows began when when Israel returned to its homeland. Jesus talked about Matthew 24. He said, this is but just the beginning of sorrows leading up to the end of time, the return of Jesus, the rapture, the great tribulation, the marriage supper of the Lamb, then the second coming, then the millennial reign. That there'll be a beginning of sorrows leading up to that with all kinds of turmoil and things. We may well be in that began on with Israel becoming a nation, 1948, something had never been done before. They'd been scattered for thousands of years. 70 AD, the Roman general Titus leveled Jerusalem and the temple to the ground. Israel was scattered all over the earth. And then amazingly, in 1948, they returned to their homeland and the nation was reestablished. Never happened before in the history of the world. No other nation. There's been many nations that have come and fallen and are no more and have never been restored, never come back. But God says in Joel, Israel is his land. The people of Israel are his people. So that's one of the signs. Another one is worldwide anti Semitism. We're seeing that on the rise, seeing the UN coming against the nation of Israel. Another one that Joel lists is nations forcing Israel to divide the land. And we've seen that in our day, in our hour. That's all prophesied in the book of Joel, that be a sign of the last days and even the last of the last days. But then Jesus in Matthew 24, many of you are familiar with this scripture, talking about the last of the last days. He said this, Matthew 24:32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also know when you see these things, when you see these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation, the generation that sees the budding of the fig tree, and most scholars, particularly people that study prophecy intensely, most are all in agreement that the budding of the fig tree was Israel becoming a nation in 1948. And Jesus says the generation that sees that will by no means pass away until all these things take place. The things he's talking about here. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. So Jesus said there'd be a generation that saw the budding of the fig tree, Israel becoming a nation. We've seen that May 14th, 1948. And he says that generation will not pass away until these things are fulfilled, until Jesus returns for his church. So, when is that going to happen? Well, 1948, At one point, people always thought that, well, you need to look at what a generation is. How long is a generation? And I better not get into that because we're out of time. We'll look at that tomorrow. But let's just pray that there'll be a great worldwide revival before the return of the Lord, great harvest of souls, and that you and I live holy, live evangelistically, and are ready for the Lord's return. We'll take it up tomorrow. Share these with people. God bless you. Let's be ready.